let's talk about the atomicity of transactions. I'd like to continue discussing it today. Today, to help us design smart contracts, I want to introduce one particular way of viewing the world, a framework for understanding it. That is states and events. States and events. So Ethereum, for example. What kind of world computer is it? It's a computer where events bring about changes in state. That's one way to define it. Not making any sense yet, right? You've probably seen divorce statistics in the news. When you look at those statistics and hear something like, the divorce rate in our country is X, you might think, wow, people are getting divorced a lot. That's a natural reaction, but divorce rate, by definition, is the number of divorces among those who've gotten married. But here's the thing, divorce is an event, whereas marriage is more like a state. When you're married to someone, you don't renew your vows every morning. Maybe during the honeymoon phase, but usually you just live together. It's just part of life. But divorce happens at a specific moment. It's a single point in time. That's why divorce rates are actually quite poor at reflecting reality, because marriage is a state and divorce is an event. Let me explain with a simpler example. Take cancer incidence rates. Cancer rates in the population keep rising. Why do they keep going up? Sure, you could say it's due to pollution and greater exposure to carcinogens. That's one perspective. But actually it's because people aren't dying from other diseases anymore. And the reason is people used to die before they had time to develop cancer. So the rise in cancer incidence is because people are living longer. It's the same with divorce rates. As the state of marriage gets stretched out due to longer life expectancy, people stay married for much longer now. In the past, marriage often ended with some other life event. So that could be through the event of divorce, though not necessarily. In the past, and still today in most cases, it ends with the death of one's spouse. The state ends through the event of death. That's how the state of marriage concludes. But now both spouses live longer, and waiting becomes exhausting, so they end up getting divorced. That might be a risky joke, I admit. Anyway, in the old days, even if you didn't like your partner, you just waited. They'd eventually disappear, or you would. But now, unless you get divorced, there's no end, it just keeps going. So, the concept of an accurate divorce rate is extremely complicated. If you try to compare the number of divorces to the number of marriages, that's flawed too. Because the couples getting married this year aren't the ones getting divorced this year. Divorces happen among accumulated couples from the past, whereas marriages are newly formed every year. So if you count this year's marriage registrations and compare them to this year's divorces, that kind of calculation, simplistically calculating divorce rates that way, leads to the most misunderstanding. So no matter how you calculate it, it's really hard to get an accurate divorce rate. This is the kind of example I use when teaching statistics to students. Now, a smart contract by nature is about changing states through events. You're essentially breaking the world into discrete parts. Either an event happens or it doesn't. There's no middle ground. It must be one or the other. That's what we mean by atomicity. If something falls into an ambiguous middle state, it can cause disputes or even be exploited by hackers to gain unfair advantages. That's why atomicity in transactions needs to be clearly and strictly defined. Let me give you a simple example. Imagine you're making wine. You could say simply once the wine is bottled, it becomes a product. Let's define it that way. But in reality, wine, it starts before grapes, with a farmer planting seedlings. From the moment you start tending the vines, that's really the beginning. But if you define it that broadly, you'll never be able to write a smart contract. Why? Because the atomicity of the transaction becomes too broad. Say you invested in a winery and you want a refund if things don't go well. If that's what you want to contract for, you could say, if the wine is completed, then I get paid in wine. But what if the wine never gets made? Then I lose all my money. So you define a certain time period. And if the wine isn't finished by then, the money I invested gets refunded to me. Great, that sounds fair. But from the winery's perspective, it's frustrating. They did everything, but they couldn't bottle it at the very end. Maybe they just couldn't get bottles in time. And time runs out, so all the investors pull their money out. Now the winery is ruined. Even though the wine is finished and high quality, they're forced to sell it off at a dirt cheap price. So this is why we break things down into states and associate those with specific events. That way we can understand the process meaningfully. And it makes sense to structure contracts accordingly. Before we even think of smart contracts as computer programs, we need to understand how to view situations. Earlier, we defined Ethereum as a world computer where events cause changes in state. That's the definition we propose. That's one way to define Ethereum. Likewise, we can think about winemaking in the same way, as a process where events cause the state to change. That's another way we can define it. Let's start from the grapes on the vine. First, the grapes must be harvested. Then they're crushed. The crushed grapes are fermented. After fermentation, you filter out impurities. And finally, it becomes wine. From the barrel-aged state, the wine is then bottled. Once bottled, it becomes a product ready to be sold. What I just explained is a very simplified model. But you can break it down into clear, discrete stages. So the aging process can be divided into stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3 of aging. To verify those stages, you might measure acidity, or use various quantifiable indicators. So you break it down this way, and finally, bottling completes the process. That's how we model it. Of course, you could divide it endlessly. If you wanted to get really granular, there's no end to it. But here's the key point. In a contract, there's always a counterparty, whether it's an investor, a customer, or a business partner. That counterparty negotiates the terms with you, so it all depends on how the contract is written. That means, based on the contract, you can shorten the stages or choose not to go into so much detail. You can even group them into larger steps. This is how we segment states in a process. Then each of these states becomes an atomic unit of an event. Depending on the state, you can maintain a corresponding ledger entry, and the ledger's state updates accordingly. So once you've broken down the events, on the blockchain, the state of the investor's funds can change. When the grapes are first harvested, 10% of the investment is released to the winery. That portion gets unlocked. Once the grapes are crushed and impurities are filtered out, another 5% gets unlocked. If the aging process proceeds successfully, yet another 5% is released. And if a certain percentage is classified as grade A wine, or above a threshold for grade B, then additional funds are transferred to the winery accordingly. So the investment you locked in might be fully released as planned and paid out in full. Or depending on the actual result, if the quantity doesn't meet the terms, or for any number of reasons, such as incomplete fermentation, or the wine getting a low grade, then not all the investment is paid out. This doesn't require human intervention. It can all be handled on the blockchain. Of course, someone at the winery or the person grading the wine, like someone measuring acidity or determining aging stages, or whoever assigns wine grades, they could collude, input false information, and deceive investors. These are what we call oracle problems. But let's set aside the oracle problem. We'll talk about that later. What blockchain can do, though, is this. Until now, investment simply meant trusting the winery one-sidedly and handing over your money. But with a smart contract, I can invest my money, and as the project progresses, funds may be fully disbursed or only partially based on the outcome. Once bottling is complete, the wine no longer belongs to the winery, it belongs to me. So if that bottle has a special verification system, including its grade and production info, then it can be tokenized. I made the investment. The wine was produced by the winery. My funds, whether in Bitcoin or Ethereum, become revenue for the winery. A unique token representing that specific wine bottle is created on the blockchain. So as events are reported, the wallet state is updated. Over there, the grape's physical state is changing, while on the blockchain, the wallet state is changing. Then the token's value, though rooted in blockchain technology, you can sell it in the supply chain market, or just keep holding it. But that bottle is going to travel all the way from Chile, right? From that point on, it enters a whole new state. So the wine is transported by truck to the port, and then it's loaded onto a ship. Wine is sensitive to temperature, and between Chile and Korea, while the ship is sailing, it has to cross the equator, right? So the wine is placed in a refrigerated container. That's why even now, if you look at Chilean wine, it says refrigerated container on it. But here's the issue. Sure, they used a refrigerated container, but did they turn the fridge on? We have no idea. In other words, we don't trust it. Because on a supply chain blockchain, the shipping company is also a participant. And sensors managed by the carrier can be attached to each container. So while my wine is in transit, important events are reported. For example, if the temperature exceeds 40 degrees Celsius, if the inside of the container goes above 40 degrees Celsius, that's automatically recorded, or if it drops below a certain threshold, also recorded. These conditions are all monitored. Every time something like that is recorded, it's added to the metadata of the token I hold. As additional descriptive info, those event records are appended. As those events get logged, they're hashed into the tail of my token's data, creating a growing chain of descriptors. Once it's automatically entered like that, no one can change it. Not the producer, not even the grade, though grade appears on the label anyway. And during transportation, how many times the temperature went out of range, and how often it happened. All of that is visible and transparent. Now the reason we tokenize it, before it even reaches the consumer, is I can bet on it. I can sell it off in advance. Basically, I'm shorting it. If I believe this shipping carrier looks sketchy, and something gets reported, then I sell that token on the market. Since the token contains wine-related information, the buyer isn't necessarily the final consumer. It could be someone trying to bulk purchase wine. They might think, this shipment looks reliable, the refrigerated container seems trustworthy. Looks undervalued to me, so they buy the token. That's how it gets traded. Now, this is all theoretical. In reality, what will happen is more like the gambler's world I mentioned. Remember I said that? These tokens will just keep getting traded over and over. And those in the middle, neither retailers nor consumers, not end consumers either, are just in it for speculation. They keep flipping these tokens, and prices are determined by the interaction of supply and demand. Just like Bitcoin, it'll be volatile, and critical events will keep getting reported along the way. For example, if the ship carrying the wine gets hijacked by pirates, that incident would be reported, right? Once the pirate attack is reported, what do you think happens to the price? Everyone will want to sell. They'll dump the tokens. With everyone selling off, the price will crash. That's the kind of structure this supply chain operates under. Now, if you've been paying attention, some parts seem handled by code, others are determined by the market. It's kind of dizzying, right? Yes, it's totally overwhelming. But if this really is the near future reality we're approaching, then you have to ask, how is this different from traditional trade? You should seriously think about that. What's different from traditional trade? Or how is this different from how we used to invest? There are three key differences. First, there are no intermediaries. No big intermediaries like banks or stock exchanges. None of that exists here. So with no intermediaries, the second key feature is anyone and everyone can participate. And one more key feature, the future that smart contracts and blockchain bring. It's not about investing in Samsung Electronics as a whole. You can invest in one specific activity Samsung carries out. And even within that activity, you can invest in a single item produced. There are no intermediaries, no arbitrators, and no official currency involved. That's pretty shocking, isn't it? There's no official currency. No dollars, no yuan, none of that. Because programmable money has to be used, like Bitcoin, Ethereum, or Ripple, or ADA, Cardano, etc. These are the types of currencies being used. You could even use tuna, or diamonds, as long as it can be tokenized and recorded as code. Do you think this kind of future will come?